Today we're diving into the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, known as the UNFCCC. It was adopted at the 1922 Rio Convention with the goal of stabilizing greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. The UNFCCC is complemented by the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Convention to Combat Desertification. Together they formed the Rio Conventions, which have the objective of producing a blueprint for international action on environmental and development issues. The UNFCCC is party-driven, which means all countries that have ratified the convention, known as members or parties, get a say. They form the Conference of the Parties, or COP, which meets once a year to discuss progress and make decisions on next steps towards achieving the goal of the convention and its treaties. The COP makes the decisions. However, the UNFCCC Secretariat keeps things running smoothly and coordinates global climate negotiations. Leading this team is the Executive Secretary, who is appointed by the UN Secretary General, with the help from a special advisory group of parties from all regions known as the COP Bureau. COP outcomes are informed by negotiations and discussions of the subsidiary bodies, SBs for short, which convene to discuss and negotiate various aspects of climate mitigation, adaptation, finance, capacity building, and technology transfer. SUBSTA stands for the Science and Technology Advice Body, which links scientific expertise and technology advancement and transfer to the UNFCCC outcomes, including through the IPCC. SBI stands for the Implementation Body, which focuses on the implementation of climate action and policies. The SBs work separately, but have joint agendas as they cooperate on cross-cutting issues within the areas of competence of both bodies. Annual dialogues, capacity building sessions, and submissions all reinforce the year-long process. Each year, a host country is selected for carrying out the negotiations. The host country, known as the COP presidency, is selected. The presidency is not just symbolic. It plays a key role in shaping the negotiations, setting the agenda, and driving consensus between nearly 200 parties. The COP presidency rotates each year between 5 UN regional groups. These groups include Africa, Asia Pacific, Eastern Europe, Latin America and Caribbean, Western Europe, and others. Countries within the chosen region volunteer to host and lead COP, and the final selection is confirmed by consensus within that region. The COP president, usually a high-level government official, is responsible for the following: chairing high-level meetings and negotiations, facilitating compromises between parties, setting the tone and priorities of the conference, appointing facilitators to guide key negotiating tracks, hosting ministerial events and side dialogues. They also work with the UNFCCC Secretariat and incoming or outgoing presidencies to ensure continuity. The COP presidency can champion climate ambition or slow things down, especially if they have ties to fossil fuel interests. While their power is not absolute, they have a huge influence on the pace, priorities, and political tone of the entire summit. Nearly 30 years of climate summits, where have they gotten us? Let's start at the beginning. The Rio Earth Summit, 1992, the birthplace of the UNFCCC. 179 countries convened to discuss the intersection of climate change, environmental and sustainable development on the international level for the first time, leading to the adoption of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and to combat desertification. The first big success of the UNFCCC was the adoption of the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. The Kyoto Protocol is the first climate treaty with real targets. Developed countries committed to cut emissions by 5.2% below 1990 levels and established the Clean Development Mechanism, or CDM, which allows a country with an emission reduction or emission limitation commitment to implement an emission reduction project in developing countries and take the carbon credit for it. Any decisions revolving around the Kyoto Protocol occur under the CMP, or the Conference of the Parties, serving as the meeting of the parties to the Kyoto Protocol. It was a milestone treaty, but it took 8 years for enough parties to ratify the treaty at home for it to come into force. And both Canada and the United States did not ratify it, leaving a gap in emissions reduction efforts from two of the largest historic emitters. It wasn't until the 13th Conference of the Parties held in December 2007 in Bali, Indonesia, where the UNFCCC saw its next breakthrough moment with the development of the Bali Roadmap for revamping climate negotiations, paving the way for one of the most memorable and significant COP outcomes of the 2010s, the Copenhagen Accord. The Copenhagen Accord was the first time there was an explicit emissions commitment by all major economies, including China, and to a global aspirational goal of limiting global temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius. It set out a process for countries to enter their specific mitigation pledges by January 31st, 2010, with accompanying reporting and verification of actions. It was also the first time a climate finance goal commitment was agreed to by developed countries, setting a $30 billion goal for 2010 to 2012 and a $100 billion goal a year in public and private finance by 2020 to help developing countries. The accord also called for the establishment of a new Green Climate Fund. Following COP15, the Cancun agreements of COP16 in 2010 proved that multilateral climate negotiations can work. In Cancun, parties created a system to help verify countries' mitigation actions and reduce deforestation under the Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation Program, known as REDD+, towards the 2-degree goal, the adaptation of the technology mechanism, which facilitated action on technology development and transfer to support climate change mitigation and adaptation, and the establishment of the Adaptation Committee for coordinating adaptation activities under the Convention, which were all adopted under the Copenhagen Accords. COP17 in Durban, South Africa is regarded as a turning point in the history of climate negotiations because governments clearly recognized the need to draw up the blueprint for a fresh universal legal agreement to deal with climate change beyond 2020, which ultimately led to the widely known Paris Agreement. We can't act on climate if we don't understand the risks or the solutions. A notable outcome of COP18 in Doha, Qatar, was the establishment of a new work program to achieve Article 6 of the Convention, focused on catalyzing climate action through holistic empowerment, education, and training. Parties adopted the term ACE, or Action for Climate Empowerment, in Doha as they created the first ACE work program for building empowerment capacity. And at COP19 in Warsaw, Poland, we saw the first recognition of the importance of addressing loss and damage through the establishment of the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage, which are the negative impacts of climate change that can be avoided by mitigation and adaptation. In Paris in 2015 came the climate game changer. Parties met the goal of agreeing to a post-2020 agreement established at COP17. With strong advocacy from small islands, parties agreed to limit warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, or 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, above pre-industrial levels, with the goal of pursuing efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees Celsius, or 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. It also called for global emissions to peak as soon as possible and reach net zero emissions in the second half of the century. In the negotiations, the Paris Agreement is known as the CMA. On the path to net zero, the Paris Agreement set up a system for countries to set their own climate plans, known as Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDCs. Instead of only developed countries contributing to climate action, the Paris Agreement set up a system for all countries to contribute. Unlike previous agreements like the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement lets each country set its own climate goals through NDCs based on what they could realistically commit to and in line with climate science as informed by the IPCC. This flexibility makes it more inclusive and politically feasible while encouraging every country to take some form of action. It also introduced a system of transparency and review to support accountability. Countries are required to report their emissions and progress with a global stocktake every 5 years to assess collective progress. It took a few years for the rules and implementation procedures of the Paris Agreement to be finalized. The next pivotal outcome is the Glasgow Climate Pact signed at COP26 in 2021. COP26 saw the first ever mention of one of the root causes of climate change, coal, and was the first time parties explicitly committed to phasing out coal. Additional commitments included the doubling of adaptation finance by 2025, revisiting and strengthening 2030 targets in NDCs, transparency in the Paris Rulebook, and a new work program on action for climate empowerment to actually strengthen informed climate action. After years of sideline discussions, parties adopt a new fund for responding to loss and damage for both economic and non-economic losses. The agreement calls for urgent and immediate need for new additional predictable and adequate financial resources to assist developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change. In addition to the Loss and Damage Fund, the inclusion of young people for the very first time at a COP outcome as stakeholders in climate decision-making and implementation as part of the Action of Climate Empowerment Action Plan was also a notable outcome. The first global stocktake, the 5-year review of NDCs, concluded at COP28 in Dubai, UAE in 2023. The global stocktake revealed we're off track for 1.5 degrees Celsius. The stark review led to the first ever inclusion of fossil fuels in a COP outcome, with a commitment to phase down fossil fuels. Other commitments included tripling renewable energy, phasing out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, and $700 million to Loss and Damage Fund. In 2024, COP29 took place in Baku, Azerbaijan. This COP was framed as the Finance COP, with a central focus on establishing a new climate finance goal to replace the unmet $100 billion USD target from Copenhagen. Studies indicate that at least $1.3 trillion are needed to address climate change globally. Countries negotiated not just how much funding is needed, but who pays, who receives, and how fast. Developing countries, particularly climate-vulnerable small island states, push for predictable, adequate, and grant-based finance, not loan, and for clear pathways to funding adaptation and loss and damage. Countries agreed to triple finance for developing nations, raising the target from $100 billion USD to $300 billion USD annually by 2035, with additional undefined efforts to be made to mobilize $1.3 trillion USD from public to private sources. Parties established a workstream for a Baku to Belém finance roadmap to be completed by COP30 as an avenue to continue mobilization discussions. After 3 decades of negotiations, climate summits, and historic agreements, from Rio to Paris to Baku, one thing is clear: climate diplomacy matters. But ambition without action, that's just paperwork. We've seen bold pledges, breakthrough moments, and the rise of youth voices and vulnerable nations demanding justice. But we've also seen delays, watered-down language, unmet finance goals, and a world still on track to warm below 2 degrees Celsius. The Paris Agreement gave us a framework. COP29 tried to give us the funds. Now the world needs follow-through. It's not enough to just attend the talks. We must raise ambition, mobilize finance, honor commitments, and protect those hit first and hardest. The future of our planet depends on what we do next. Let's make it count together.